Before binding the quilt, you do need to square off the corners and make sure that all of the edges are straight, trim back that excess backing and batting. I am getting these 2 mini quilts ready for my binding series where I'm going to compare binding methods. So I thought I would just kind of share my thought process and my method for squaring up these quilts. Both of these are very small quilts, but this is the same process I use on a large quilt, bed-size quilt, whatever size. It might actually be easier to understand with me showing it on a small one. First, I take a square ruler and I square up the sides. I am choosing to first go off of the top because that is more straight than my side. And then I'm making sure that where I'm cutting on the side, there is at least a little bit of overhang, because I want to make sure that the entire quilt top is covering the front and it's not just a layer of backing and backing. Once I have that first corner squared off, I need to then continue that cut all the way down to the bottom edge. And there is definitely more than one way to do this. First, you could butt up another ruler on the side like this, and that would make it straight down. This might be the most accurate, but I always find it's hard to hold the rulers that way without switching which side of the table you're cutting from. Another way is to butt it up against the bottom. And then lastly, this is probably the least accurate, but probably the easiest to handle, is just moving that ruler down, lining it up against the previous line, and then making your cut. I'm really not too picky about how square my quilts end up. As long as they're mostly straight, I'm usually cool with it. But I know some people like things as near to perfect as they can get them, so I like to share multiple options. And instead of trying to cut sideways, I rotate the quilt 90 degrees and then start along the next edge. So I am lining up that top edge that is already squared up, and then slide my ruler over to the right edge here to make sure I'm cutting off as little as possible, but still cutting off at least a little bit from the entire edge, so that is nice and straight. And then removing that, and then if you had a larger quilt, you just keep moving your ruler down till you get to the next corner, rotate 90 degrees again, and repeat the same process. So I'm lining up that top edge, and then I will make my cut on the right side again. If your square ruler is small and you want to use like a long 24-inch ruler instead, you could use that by lining up one of the lines on that ruler with the top edge and then making your cut to the right. See here, I have quite a bit of overhang on the right where my quilt top is, so I do like to move it over to where I can get to kind of like the shortest amount of scrap possible, and then I will make my cut. I'm trying to lose as little as I can from my quilt top. And there you have it. I have a squared up quilt top. This is what it looks like after, and this is what it looked like before, or similar to this. This is the other one I made. When you first start quilting, binding can seem really intimidating because there are literally so many ways to do this, so many different tutorials out there. I just made these 2 mini quilts. One of them I bound completely by machine, and the other one I stitched the binding on the back. The main difference between these 2 methods is probably how long it takes and the look of it. So tell me, just by looking at the 2, which one would you prefer? I will be covering both ways from start to finish, and first, for both methods, we need to attach the binding strip to the front of the quilt. You will want to leave a tail unstitched when you first start, probably around 8 to 10 inches, and then you can pick any edge of your quilt. Since this is a small mini quilt, I am picking one of the longer edges to start on so that I have more room to work with when I need to connect those 2 binding strips. Where my finger is, I will begin stitching around that point. Before we begin, I strongly recommend using your walking foot. This will more evenly feed your fabric through and just make it turn out better usually. If you're not sure how to use your walking foot or attach it to your machine, leave me a comment and I will make a separate video on this. Like I said, we're going to leave at least an 8 to like 10 inch tail unstitched and then begin stitching this on. You'll want to make sure the raw edges are on the outside and the folded edge is towards the inside of your quilt. You'll want to line this right up with the edge of your quilt and begin stitching it on 1/4 inch from the edge. Give it a back stitch in the beginning and then just begin sewing along the entire edge till I get to the corner. Now you don't want to sew all the way to the corner. You want to stop about 1/4 inch from the corner. So if you're new to quilting, I would suggest using a ruler and marking. I know this seems like a pain, but it's totally worth it to get some nicer looking corners. So I'm lining up my ruler on the bottom edge there, 1/4 inch away from the edge, and then marking that on the binding. It's kind of hard to see because I use a hair marker and this is white fabric, but you will sew all the way up to that 1/4 inch mark, then lift up your foot, rotate your quilt 45 degrees, and then sew off the corner at the angle there. Then you can cut your threads, remove it from the machine, and it should look something like this. Turn your quilt and fold it up at a 45-degree angle, so it should be slanted like that. And then I like to use a ruler to place it down and fold it back down at a 90-degree angle. Now it should be lined up with that raw edge of your quilt. You can pin or clip it in place, and then we begin stitching again right from the top edge there, 1/4 inch away from the right edge. And then you follow the same process along the entire edge of the quilt, and then do another corner when you get down to the bottom again. Keep doing this until you get to the last edge of your quilt where you started. When you get to that last edge, do not sew your binding all the way to where you started. Stop about 8 to 12 inches away from where you started. You'll want to leave plenty of room so that we can connect the two ends of the binding strips, and I will show you how to do that in the So you started binding your quilt, but you have no idea how to connect these two binding strip ends. I'll show you the two ways that I prefer to do this. One will be with a horizontal seam and the other with a diagonal seam. Like all things in quilting, there are other ways to do this too. So if how I explain it doesn't make sense to you, just keep looking for other options. If you're not sure which to use, I like to use the horizontal seam for scrappy binding, or it works well with this one too because it's striped. But I usually use the diagonal seam for all other instances because the horizontal seam can be a little bulky. Because I usually prefer the diagonal seam, I'll start with that one first. You'll want to leave about 8 to 12 inches between the two ends of your binding strip. You could do even more if you want. I like to have closer to a foot just because there's more room to work with it. But going much more beyond that is going to leave more room for error. I would say just start trying with like 10 to 12 inches. You're going to take these two strips and fold them back on themselves. If you have a lot of extra, you can cut that away. We don't need a ton of extra, but you do want some. I left, I don't know, maybe 6 inches on mine. So like I said, we're going to fold the binding strips back on themselves until they almost meet in the middle, but you want to leave a little gap, maybe about 1/8 to 1/4 inch in between the two folds here. Then I'd like to take this over to my iron and give it a good press because you're going to want to be able to see those fold lines clearly. Next, I take the bottom strip and open it up so that right side of the fabric is facing down. You don't want to twist it any more than just opening it up, and then find that point where the two folds meet and stick a pin in it. Next, take the top strip and open it up, but this time we're going to have the right side of the fabric facing upwards. It's kind of hard to see where my folds meet here, but you're going to want to find that point and then stick the pin through there too. So now the two right sides of the fabrics should be facing each other. Again, try not to twist either of the strips more than just opening them up. Then we're going to line up both of the creases, the horizontal with the vertical and the vertical with the horizontal on the other one, so it makes like an X shape. Whatever is going on with your quilt on the left is totally fine. You can bunch it up as much as you need. What really matters is where these two pieces of fabric or binding strips are meeting need to be very flat. Completely flat, actually. That's why it's important to leave yourself enough room between where you started and ended stitching your binding onto the quilt, because the less room you have, the harder it is two binding strips completely flat. Once you have lined up the creases going both ways and the center points are lined up, you are going to want to pin these in place. Again, make sure it's nice and flat. I usually use 2 or 3 pins to hold this. Next, we are going to mark a line where we are going to sew these together, going from the top to the bottom like so. The two loose ends should be on one side of the line and the two connected ends should be on the other side. I usually use like a fabric pen or a hair marker and a ruler to mark this line. And then we're going to take it to our sewing machine and sew right along the line. You want to double check that the two loose ends are on one side of the line and the two connected ends are on the other side. You do not want to do it this way. That will not work out and you'll just have to seam rip it and try again. Trust me, I've done it about 1,000,000 times. Once you've sewn along that line, it'll look like this. And what I do is go ahead and pull it straight and make sure it is laying how I want it to before trimming back those loose ends. Your quilt should be nice and flat and it shouldn't be pulling too hard on it. If it's a little bit off, just rip it out and try again. If it's looking good, you'll want to trim this back so it just has a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then you can press it if you want and then finish stitching the rest of the binding down just like you were before. Now instead, if you want to do a horizontal seam, which is usually what I do when I'm doing scrappy binding, it's also a little bit of an easier option if it's just too confusing for you right now to do the diagonal seam. You will begin the same way, which is folding the binding back onto itself. This time I actually have the folds meet in the middle instead of leaving that small gap. And you go ahead and open up both strips and place them right sides together like this. Again, whatever's going on with your quilt on the left is totally fine. Bunch it up as much as you need. Then all you need to do is line up where those two folds are. Again, I'm sorry it's hard to see with this white fabric, but it's right along like where that blue line is. So I just line up those 2 press marks, and then the rest of the strip should also line up just straight like so. We are then going to sew right along where that pressed line is, straight from the top of the strip to the bottom of the strip. Again, it's really important that both of the binding strips are laying nice and flat, and in this one, just make sure it's lined up the top and bottom edges all the way down the strip so that we are as straight as possible. Pin it in place, sew along that line, and this is what it should look like in the end. Again, I do recommend opening it up and making sure it's good before you trim back the excess. When it's all good, go ahead and take your rotary cutter or scissors and cut it back to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Press if you want. I like to press this one open for sure, just to reduce the bulk of the seam, and then just finish sewing it on like you had been around the rest of your quilt. Next, I will cover attaching it to the back. If you want to finish your quilt completely with your sewing machine, this video is for you. Make sure to save it for later. I am showing my favorite method to machine bind a quilt. And if you're learning how to hand stitch it on instead, check out my next video after this. With both methods, I like to use my iron to press up the binding from where I previously stitched it to the front. I have found that this just opens up that seam nicely so that we can get it more evenly attached to the back. Then I flip over my quilt and I'm going to position my binding to where I want it stitched down. You can just use binding clips for this step, but when I machine bind my quilts, I really like to use a method called glue basting. Since this is called basting, that means I'm just temporarily holding it in place so that it sticks nice for when I am stitching I use washable school glue. You can use a stick or the liquid kind. I prefer the liquid. And you just put a very thin line of the glue along the line where you're going to want to put down your binding, and then you iron it to dry and set that glue so it is dry and it sticks in place. You'll see here I'm working on one of those mitered corners. What I do is I fold down one side completely, and then there should be like a 45-degree kind of hanging off the side, and then I fold down the other edge. You can kind of mess around with it until it looks how you like, and then I like to place an extra clip there on top of the glue just to hold it in place. Honestly, I was really nervous and kind of weirded out about putting glue on my quilt when I first saw this method, but it always washes out, and my binding turns out so much nicer with this glue basting method instead of using clips or pins. I actually do not use glue basting when I hand stitch on my binding though, so if you're going to be watching my next video, you can skip this step or you can try it. The most important things about this step in the method I like to use, which I'm showing here, is that you are covering up that previous stitch line from when you attach it to the front. So you'll see here there's a little white line where my stitches are. I'm making sure that my binding fold is always covering that. Once the binding is glued or clipped in place, whatever method you prefer, it is time to stitch it down. I actually now stitch on the front. Like I said, we're covering up that previous stitch line, so it should catch the binding on the back. Then I stitch on the front slightly in from where the binding meets the quilt top. Just go around the entire perimeter of the quilt that way. I'd say it's less than 1/8 inch in. I just prefer this look. You could also try stitching right in that seam, which is called stitching in the ditch. Maybe try both and see what you like best. If you use pins or clips, just make sure to remove those as you go, and then just like sewing any corner, I stop at the corner with my needle down, lift my foot, and rotate. I also really like to use a walking foot during this step, and that's how it turns out. One of the best parts about machine binding is how quick it is, though I have to admit I have really grown to love hand stitching on the binding instead, so I will be sharing that next. If you want to try hand stitching your binding onto the back of your quilt, save this one for later. This one's for you. I'm going to show you how I like to do it. We are picking up at the point where I've already machine stitched my binding onto the front and now need to flip it over onto the back, and I will be hand stitching it on. A lot of people stay away from this method because they think it'll take too long, but honestly I think it goes by so quick. I've really been liking the look of it being hand stitched on because you don't see any of the stitches compared to when you machine bind your quilt. I have been meaning to try clear thread though, so I will give that a try, the machine binding method, and maybe compare that to this. Anyway, back to finishing our binding. First, just like with the machine binding method, I like to press the binding open so that we get that seam nice and open before we flip it over. And then I flip it over and start to clip it down in place with some binding clips. I like to give it a press to make sure that it is nice and evenly pressed down. I do not use my favorite method of glue basting here because you kind of need to lift up the binding when you start and stop your stitches. So I've just found it easier not to glue baste it at this point. I have the binding flipped over to the other side and clipped in place. I get my supplies. You'll need a needle and thread. I'm using Aurifil cotton 50 weight thread here. You don't want to go with much thicker thread because you don't want to be able to see the stitches. And then I'm using this gold eye needle. I probably could go with a smaller needle, but this is just what I have. And when possible, try to pick a thread color that will match either the binding or your backing. Both would be best. I just went with white here since my binding is white. When you cut your thread, you're not going to cut so much thread that it will bind your whole quilt at once. That would just be way too long of a piece. I would do something about an arm's length or shorter. Longer than that, it's going to get twisted up and just in the way. It's just too long. Then you will thread your needle, tie a quilter's knot. To tie a quilter's knot, you have your needle in one hand and the end of the thread in the other. Then you kind of grab it with the hand that has your needle and twist it around the needle as many times as many knots you want. Since this is pretty thin thread, I think I did like 6, 7, or maybe even 8 to make a pretty large knot. And then once you have it twisted around, you grab where that is on the needle and pull it all the way down the needle into the end of your thread like that. And then this is what your knot should kind of look like. Mine's a little sloppy, but it's fine. I wouldn't worry about it too much. To begin my stitches, I'm going to stick my needle in through the backing fabric and the batting, but not through the front of your quilt. Through this entire process, you should not be sticking your needle through the top of the quilt at all, just through the backing and maybe the batting. I pop in my knot right in the middle like this. So what I'm doing is that knot is kind of stuck at where my needle first went in, and then I yank it until it gets stuck at the second spot where my needle came out. I just started in the middle of my quilt or the middle of my quilt backing there to do it, but you could also do this like within the binding fabric, underneath the binding, so it's even more hidden. Honestly, I don't think it really matters. You'll just want your needle to be coming out kind of where you want to start stitching, which should be where the fold of your binding is. I make a small stitch right where I'm going to start stitching on my binding, and then another back stitch to kind of secure that in place. This can be just a really small stitch there to get it going. And then I fold my binding back down to where I want it. And then I like to place a few clips kind of exactly where I'm working to keep things in place. And then once you've taken a small stitch in just the backing fabric here, you can go ahead and pull your needle through that small stitch there, just through the backing. Again, we're not going through the front of your quilt at all. And then the next stitch you will take in the fold of your binding fabric. This can be like about 1/4 inch. Sometimes when I get going, I take even larger stitches here. You'll kind of just figure out along the way how you want to do it. And then you take another one of those little stitches just through the backing fabric. And then we go back into the fold again, and then back into the backing fabric again, and we just repeat this over and over. Once you get going, you might find that it's easier to just take both of these stitches in one motion. So here I'll show you with my next one. I go into that fold of the binding, and then my needle comes out through that fold of the binding, but then instead of pulling it out, I then stick it in through that little stitch through the backing fabric, and this will just make things go quicker. I know that I've heard from a lot of you that time is the main concern with this method, so this could definitely speed things up. Honestly, I've just enjoyed being able to sit away from my sewing machine to work on some sewing. I can do this while my kids are busy or I'm watching TV. I've found it actually very enjoyable, which is something I honestly thought I'd never say because I used to be machine binding 100% of the time. You will just continue on with that small stitch and then the larger stitch in the fold of your binding until you get to the mitered corner. As I approach this corner, I try to take a stitch through the fold of the binding and then down through the backing as close to the corner as I can get. Then I take a stitch back up through the binding and then through the corner of the other binding too. Honestly, I'm not sure if this is the exact correct method for this. Quilt police, please don't come after me for this. This is just how I found works for me and holds it in place. Then I take a small stitch back down into the other piece of the binding and back up again where my needle came up before, like this. Then after I pull that through, I stick my needle into the fold of the binding, so that fold that's going up at a 45-degree angle towards the corner of my quilt. I stick it up through there and come back out about halfway, maybe a little farther up. And then I pull my needle out there and then do another little small stitch connecting the two corners of the binding again. So it's almost like kind of like a loop to hold it all in place. And I actually do 2 stitches up here like that. Next, I stick my needle back into that fold and travel back down to where I started at the bottom. And then pull my needle through here. Then once more, go back into the binding and grab a piece of the backing fabric on the way out. Here, I'm trying to get my needle to come out as close to the fold as possible, and then I will continue on with that same method I was using before along the entire edge until I run out of thread or I am done binding my quilt. If you want to also see how I tie it off at the end, when I run out of thread or when I finish, let me know and I will share a video of that as well. If it's been on your to-do list to try hand stitching binding, definitely give it a try. Trust me, you won't regret it. It is easier than you think.